The gilded ballroom in Paris was humming with the low murmur of power, a sound I knew better than my own name. I moved through the glittering crowd, my heart a cold, steady drum against my ribs, and approached Admiral Hayes, a decorated 4-star officer whose time was famously more valuable than gold. He looked down at me, his brow furrowed in a clear display of annoyance at being interrupted by someone he didn't recognize. I leaned in close, my voice barely a breath against the soaring notes of the string quartet, and said the one word that would change everything: Oracle. The Admiral's eyes, sharp and dismissive just a moment before, widened in stark recognition. All annoyance evaporated, replaced by a cold, immediate comprehension that bypassed all rank and protocol. He turned and followed me without a single word of question. 2 steps later, a silenced shot cracked the air, slamming into the ornate marble column right where his head had been. Across the room, I saw the smug expression on my father's face collapse into utter disbelief. Just 2 minutes before that bullet flew, my father, Ambassador Thompson, a man who measured worth by the prestige of a title and the weight of a handshake, was holding court. He gestured towards me with a proprietary flourish, pulling me into the orbit of the Admiral's powerful attention as if presenting a mildly interesting curio. "And this is my Alara," he announced, his voice dripping with that familiar condescending affection he reserved for my supposed hobbies. "She's just the translator." He let out a small, knowing chuckle. "Helps keep these tedious multilateral talks from turning into a shouting match. A useful, if quiet, profession." I stood there, my face a perfect mask of polite neutrality I had perfected over a lifetime, but inside a quiet, cold fury began to build. It was the same fury I felt when he called my advanced degree a nice little certificate, just another entry in the long internal ledger of 1,000 tiny dismissals. The small crowd around my father offered those weak, obligatory smiles people give when they feel they're supposed to. Admiral Hayes gave me a perfunctory nod, his gaze already sliding past me, deeming me utterly irrelevant to the real conversation between important men. He had already placed me in a mental box labeled staff, unseen, unheard, and unimportant. And in that single, dismissive gesture, my mission became infinitely harder. The insult wasn't just personal. It was tactical. My father hadn't just belittled me in front of a colleague, he had actively compromised my ability to function in a threat environment. How do you warn a man who has already been professionally told you have nothing of substance to say? You don't have time for persuasion. You only have time for authority. An authority my father never knew I possessed. My father's laugh echoed in the grand hall, branding me with a title he found fitting: just the translator. He had no idea he wasn't just insulting his daughter, he was ignoring a Tier 1 intelligence asset in the middle of an active threat zone. To understand why a 4-star admiral would obey the whisper of a translator, you have to understand the 2 lives I was living, and why one was about to violently erase the other. To truly understand the moment that bullet hit the marble, you have to understand that I existed as 2 different people. For years I had been living a life cleaved in 2, a stark duality separated by a wall of willful ignorance. In one world I was a ghost, a footnote in my own family's story. In the other, I was a queen in a kingdom of shadows, a place where my true name was spoken with a respect my father reserved only for men with flags on their lapels. I learned to navigate the gulf between these 2 realities with a quiet precision. I had to. Survival demanded it. One world was my life, the other was just where I lived. I remember a Christmas dinner from a few years back, the house filled with the scent of pine and roasting turkey, the air warm with feigned cheer. There, at the head of the table, sat my brother, Michael, the family's golden boy, who wore his charisma like a perfectly tailored suit. My father raised a glass, his face glowing with pride. He launched into a booming toast about Michael's latest achievement, closing a major real estate deal downtown. To hear my father tell it, you'd think Michael had personally brokered peace in the Middle East, not just sold a commercial property. The praise was effusive, detailed, and loud. When he finally finished and the polite applause died down, I saw a small opening. I tried, foolishly, to build a bridge across the chasm. "That's amazing, Mike," I said, my voice quiet. Speaking of work, I actually received something special last month. The Director of National Intelligence's commendation for my analytical work. A silence fell over the table for a moment. This award was the highest honor in my field, a recognition of work that had directly prevented a catastrophic international event. I didn't say that part, of course. I just offered the title. My father looked at me, a polite smile fixed on his face. He reached over and patted my hand dismissively. "That's lovely, dear," he said, his tone the one you'd use for a child's macaroni art. "A little plaque for your desk." "Wonderful." Then, without missing a beat, he turned back to my brother. "So, Michael, tell us about the zoning challenges." And just like that, I vanished. The internal ledger in my mind clicked over, another entry filed away next to all the others, another success rendered invisible. Now, contrast that with a Tuesday night, 6 months later. The time was 3:17 a.m. I was in a place my family couldn't even imagine, a sensitive compartmented information facility, or SCIF. The air was kept at a constant Arctic chill, and the only sound was the low, steady hum of servers processing petabytes of data from across the globe. My world was silent, focused, and bathed in the blue glow of 5 different monitors. I wasn't translating. I was performing advanced linguistic forensics, running fragmented SIGINT chatter from a deep cover source through predictive algorithms I had helped design. For days I had been hunting a ghost in the machine, a whisper of a threat that no one else could isolate. And then I saw it. A pattern bloomed from the chaos, a nexus point where 3 seemingly unrelated data streams converged. It was a digital fingerprint, a precise location. A high-value target who had been off the grid for 2 years was about to surface. There was no fanfare, no toast. I simply stood up and walked over to my section chief, a grim-faced man who rarely spoke and smiled even less. He reviewed my analysis, his eyes scanning the data with an intensity that missed nothing. He looked at the screen, then at me. After a long, silent moment, he gave a single, curt nod. "Deploy the response team," he said. "Good work, Oracle." Those 4 words, spoken in a near whisper in that cold, dark room, held more respect and true acknowledgement than a lifetime of my father's loud, empty praise. That was my world. That was my reality. This entire dynamic was held together by my mother, Carol, a woman who believed family peace was more important than individual fairness. A few days after that Christmas dinner, she called me. I could hear her stirring tea on her end of the line. "Alara, honey," she began, her voice soft and placating. "Please don't be upset about your father. You know how he is." I waited, knowing the rest of the script by heart. His world is so concrete: embassies, state dinners, things he can see and touch. He just can't wrap his head around your complex computer work. She sighed. "It's just easier for him to think of you as the brilliant translator he watched in college. Just let him be proud his own way. It keeps things simple." I realized in that moment she wasn't just making excuses. She was the chief architect of my invisibility. She was the one who carefully wallpapered over the cracks to maintain the family's perfect facade. For years, I had kept my 2 worlds separate, the diplomat's daughter and Oracle. I let them believe their version of me because it was easier, but the chatter I was tracking before the Paris summit was getting louder. The patterns were too clean. I realized I couldn't keep the worlds separate any longer. One was about to bleed into the other, and I had to be the one to control the fallout. The decision to go to Paris wasn't about setting a trap for my father. It was about stopping a bullet. For 2 weeks I had been tracking whispers of an assassination plot, a faint signal buried under mountains of digital noise. The intelligence came from a new, unproven source, which meant in the cold, hard world of bureaucracy, it was considered thin. It wasn't enough to trigger a formal threat warning that could disrupt a global summit. My superiors saw the data, but their hands were tied by procedure and probability models. They wouldn't act. I felt a familiar, cold frustration settle in my gut, the same feeling I got when faced with an obstacle that was illogical but absolute. I made a procedural decision of my own. If the system wouldn't let me stop the threat from the outside, I would have to stop it from the inside. I wouldn't fight the system, I would leverage it. My official cover was that of a simple, unassuming translator, and I decided to use that persona, the one my father had so carefully crafted for me, as my key. I navigated the agency's internal personnel system and filed a formal request to be placed on the linguistic support detail for the Department of Defense delegation. I cited my specific and rare fluency in the Chechen dialect the Admiral's counterpart spoke. It was the perfect, irrefutable reason for me to be in that specific room at that specific time. A few days later, my father saw my name on the official roster. He sent me a short, condescending email. "Glad to see you're getting a nice trip to Paris out of this, Alara. Try to enjoy the sights." He had no idea I had engineered my own deployment. The night before the flight, I had a secure video call with my section chief. His face was a grainy image on my encrypted terminal, his expression as grim as always. He was a man who trusted instincts over algorithms. "The data's not actionable by Langley's standards, Oracle," he said, his voice a low rasp. "But your record is. The official channels are closed on this, so you're our only asset inside that room." He paused, his eyes seeming to bore through the screen. "You have Whisper Protocol authority. If you get a positive visual on the threat, you act. Don't wait for confirmation." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. "Your word is the confirmation." This wasn't just permission, it was a transfer of immense authority, a quiet acknowledgement that in this one instance, my judgment overruled everything else. The flight to Paris was quiet. My father chatted about cocktail parties and diplomatic posturing. I was reviewing encrypted threat profiles on a shielded tablet. He thought I was on his trip. The truth was, he was in my operational theater. The main hall of the Élysée Palace was a sea of calculated smiles and quiet power. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the weight of international prestige and the scent of expensive perfume. For my father, Ambassador Thompson, this was not a room, it was a stage, and he was its leading man. He glided through the crowd with an effortless confidence, a handshake here, a shared laugh there, soaking in the reflected glory of the powerful men around him. I walked a step behind him, a silent shadow in his wake. My eyes, however, weren't on the shimmering chandeliers or the famous works of art. My gaze was a constant sweeping search pattern, analyzing movement, posture, and personnel. I was a hunter, and this opulent palace was my hunting ground. Then, my father spotted his quarry, Admiral Hayes. He put a hand on my arm, pulling me along with him, completely oblivious to the fact that he was dragging his primary defense asset directly into the path of a potential threat. He reached the Admiral with a triumphant smile, clapping him warmly on the shoulder. And then came the line I knew was coming, the one he'd been polishing for just such an occasion. "And this is my daughter, Ilara," he said, gesturing to me. "She's just the translator." As his voice droned on, delivering his familiar, dismissive introduction, I tuned him out. His words were just meaningless background noise, like the clinking of champagne glasses. My attention was fixed on the perimeter of the room, my mind a cold running calculus of risk. I was cataloging the waitstaff, the security movements, the sight lines from every door and window. My father thought he was defining my role in his world. He had no idea I was actively working to make sure his world didn't violently cease to exist in the next 5 minutes. And then I saw him. He was dressed as a waiter, holding a silver tray of drinks, but everything about him was wrong. It was in the details, the kind of details my father's world of broad handshakes and loud pronouncements would never notice. His posture was too rigid for a server, more like a soldier at rest. His eyes weren't on the guests he was supposed to be serving. They were moving constantly, tracking a single point across the room. Admiral Hayes. He matched the physical description from the intel packet almost perfectly, and his path through the crowd was not random. It was a slow, deliberate convergence. My blood ran cold as I watched his hand, the one not holding the tray, subtly drift towards the inside of his jacket. My training took over. There was no more time for observation. There was only time for action. I moved. I cut through the space between my father and the Admiral, my own posture now rigid with purpose. "Admiral Hayes," I said, my voice low and controlled, cutting through my father's story. "Come with me. Now. Don't ask." The Admiral glanced down at me, a flicker of pure annoyance crossing his features at being ordered around by someone he'd already dismissed as staff. He started to wave me off, his mouth opening to form a rebuke. "Young lady, I'm in the middle of—" I didn't let him finish. I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a steely official whisper that carried no trace of the diplomat's daughter. "Sir, I am invoking Whisper Protocol under clearance Sierra Omega 7. My call sign is Oracle." I held his gaze. "You need to move. Now?" The change was instantaneous. The name Oracle and the clearance code were not a request, they were a command from a higher, more urgent authority he was duty-bound to obey. The annoyance on his face vanished, replaced by the cold, sharp understanding of a man who suddenly realized he was standing on a landmine. He didn't question it. He didn't hesitate. He simply turned and moved with me, his own training kicking in. My father watched us go, his face a mask of confused, sputtering fury. Why was this 4-star admiral listening to his daughter? The silenced enfut of a single gunshot and the sharp crack of shattering marble behind us provided the answer. The room froze for a heartbeat, and then erupted into chaos. Security personnel swarmed around us, creating a human shield, their voices sharp and urgent in their earpieces. In the midst of the panic, my gaze found my father. He was standing frozen, his face drained of all color, his eyes locked on the new hole in the marble column where the Admiral's head had been just seconds before. He looked at me, then at the swarm of agents surrounding me and the man I had just saved. His mind, slow and clumsy compared to the world I lived in, was struggling to connect the dots. Then, the security chatter cut through the noise, loud and clear. Oracle has the principal. I repeat, Oracle has the principal. Secure the perimeter. I watched the moment the name registered. Oracle. A legendary call sign from the most highly classified briefings, a ghost in the intelligence community whispered about with a mixture of fear and awe. I saw his entire worldview, his understanding of me, of his own importance, of the very structure of his reality, crack and then shatter in a single silent moment. His smirk was gone, his pride was gone, replaced by the slack-jawed shock of a man who just realized the footnote had written the entire book. My father had spent a lifetime defining me with his words. In the end, it only took one of mine to show him he never knew me at all. In the aftermath, the chaos of the ballroom was replaced by the sterile silence of a secure debriefing room deep within the embassy. The air was cold, smelling of filtered air and electronics. I stood at the head of a long table, speaking in calm, clinical tones as I walked a crisis response team through the incident, minute by painful minute. The data points, the threat indicators, the procedural steps, it all flowed out of me, precise and detached. Admiral Hayes stood against the far wall, his arms crossed, observing not as a superior but as a witness. He didn't interrupt, he just listened, his expression a mixture of profound gratitude and a newfound sober respect. In that room, surrounded by professionals who understood the language of my real life, I felt a sense of calm I had never known. The two worlds had collided, and only one had survived. That was when my father appeared at the doorway. He looked small and lost, his diplomat swagger completely gone, replaced by a pale, uncertain confusion. He took a step into the room, his mouth opening as if to speak my name. Before he could utter a sound, a stern-faced CIA officer I hadn't even noticed before moved to block his path. "Sir, this is an active debriefing," the officer said, his voice quiet but unyielding. "I'm going to have to ask you to wait outside." My father blinked, momentarily trying to summon his old authority. "I am Ambassador Thompson, this is my—" But the Admiral cut him off. He turned from the wall, his voice not loud, but carrying the absolute weight of his 4 stars. "Ambassador," he said, his eyes locking with my father's. "Your daughter just saved my life, and likely averted an international incident. I suggest you give her space." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order that drew an uncrossable line. For the first time in his life, my father was on the outside of a room, looking in at a world where his title meant nothing, and mine meant everything. 6 months later, I was standing in front of a wall of massive screens in the Global Operations Center at CIA headquarters in Langley. The title on my door read Section Chief, and the newly formed Predictive Threat Analysis Division was mine to lead. The quiet, useful profession my father had mocked was now at the forefront of national security. I was no longer just the analyst called Oracle, I was the one who directed the other oracles. That morning, I was briefing the director of the CIA himself, along with a liaison from the Joint Chiefs. I pointed to a developing situation on the map, my voice steady as I outlined the threat vectors and our proposed response. No one patted my hand. No one called my work lovely. They just listened, their expressions grim and focused, because my words had the power to move assets, change policy, and save lives. My authority wasn't loud, it was quiet, absolute, and earned. The people in that room, and the brilliant, dedicated analysts on my team, had become my real family. They were a tribe forged not by blood or obligation, but by the gravity of our shared mission and a deep, mutual respect for competence. They didn't see me as just the translator or the diplomat's quiet daughter. They saw the person who could find the single dissonant note in a global symphony of noise. They saw Oracle. There were no golden children here, no invisible ones. There were only assets and objectives, trust and capability. In the quiet intensity of our work, surrounded by people who saw me for exactly who I was, I found a sense of peace that my own home had never been able to provide. Then, one quiet afternoon in my office overlooking the forested campus, the past tried to reach out. An email notification popped up on my screen. The sender was my father. The subject line contained a single hesitant word, dinner. I clicked it open. The message was short, stripped of all its former bluster. He wrote that he would be in DC next month, that he would like to see me, that he wanted a chance to understand. I read the words over and over, feeling not anger, not triumph, but a strange and profound sense of calm detachment. The old wound, the one that had ached for a lifetime seeking acknowledgement, had finally scarred over. It was a part of my history, but it no longer hurt to the touch. I looked at his plea, this olive branch from a world I no longer truly inhabited. I thought about all the years I had craved a moment like this, a moment of apology, of recognition, and I realized, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I no longer needed it. My validation didn't come from his approval anymore. It came from the respect of my peers, the weight of my work, and the quiet confidence in my own abilities. With a single, deliberate click, I moved the message from my inbox to the archive. I didn't reply. I didn't delete it. I simply filed it away, a relic of a former life, and turned my full attention back to the classified report on my desk. My father thought my job was to interpret language for powerful men. He never realized my job was to give powerful men a reason to listen. If you've ever had to prove your worth to people who refuse to see it, share your story below. In this community, your expertise is always recognized.